Thank you very much, Jens, for introducing me and for inviting me to come to Oxford. And I wish you all a very nice morning. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about the person, the subject, subjectivity, God, and the person today. And I also look forward to our discussion. In a certain way, many of my ideas are very, very close to Jens's ideas, but I try to provide an approach to the question of personhood and subjectivity from a merely philosophical point of view, but then religion comes into play and does play a major role as well. As you can see, there are 5 parts, and I would like to begin by talking about the need to go beyond the dialectics of anti-humanism and transhumanism. And as we've already seen in Jens's paper, there seems to be an ongoing controversy about the nature of a human person. And we could say there is a gigantomachia about the human person going on nowadays. This is, if you've read Heidegger's Being and Time, you know that he starts about the gigantomachia about being. But I think what's much more important nowadays is the struggle for a good, a proper, appropriate understanding of a human person. And Jens's paper has shown that transhumanism provides a specific view of who the human being is that really questions many of our common sense ideas of who a human being is, many of the traditional views as well. And it is a big challenge nowadays, I think, to counter this transhumanist view. Let me briefly begin by looking at the scene in which we talk about this. Nietzsche's atheism is very radical, much more radical than Marx's or Feuerbach's atheism. And the reason is that he realized that the message of the death of God is by no means a positive message, but a message of despair. And you could say that what is closely linked to the message of the death of God is the death of man as well. And if you look at the history of 20th century philosophy, you see that based on Nietzsche, we do have philosophers such as structuralist philosophers who then deny the existence of a subject, or who basically just do not talk about the human being, or the dignity of a human being, or the dignity of a person anymore, but simply say, with God, the human being has died as well. And this is why I think we have a close link between the death of God and the death of the human being. And what we can see nowadays is a dialectic of anti-humanism, so denial of the human being and his dignity, and transhumanism. Just to give you an example, at least in Germany, I know here in the UK as well, in the US, Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus has been a best-selling book. And this book is quite interesting because it shows just this very, very dialectic, because either human beings will become just like machines, or will be subject to what he calls dataism, to the power of the big computers, or they will be transformed in such a way that Jens already mentioned in this transhumanist way, so they will become basically gods. The title of his book is Homo Deus, so the human being as God. And I think this is the situation in which we nowadays think about the human being, a dialectic of anti-humanism, so the denial of human dignity, or the transhumanistic sort of overemphasis on specific features, and the optimism that's linked to it as well. And I do think modernity is in itself dialectic, and this is the shape of a kind of dialectic that we are facing nowadays, the dialectic of anti-humanism and transhumanism. And I do think what we need to do nowadays is, and I think this is the aim of this conference as well, to think again about the possibilities and the conditions of a new kind of humanism. And I think the most important reason here is that the traditional self-understanding of a person reflects very much our own self-understanding. So we have to defend the life world understanding of the human person, of the human being, again, over against reductionist, simplicistic accounts of a human being. And I think this is one of the big challenges, and I would like to show you a way of doing so. This is part of, so my paper is based on my current thinking about human dignity. And I think there are different ways of understanding, of defining human dignity. And I would like to argue that there are different starting points possible. The problem very often is that people just choose one distinct starting point because they think the paradigms from within which they develop their thinking are mutually incompatible. But I do think the best way of thinking about human being is to combine these different starting points. One starting point would be human nature. And this could lead to some kind of natural law defense of human dignity. To say, well, by virtue of human nature, the human being has a specific dignity. The second starting point is the starting point from subjectivity. So the experience of being a subject is here the starting point. And you can see that sort of modern philosophy, modern, say, idealist philosophy or Kantian philosophy takes its starting point from the experience of subjectivity. And I do want to follow this trajectory in my paper. A third starting point, which does play a role in my paper as well, is the starting point from intersubjectivity, the sort of interpersonal relation. This is where recognition plays a role in Hegel or in Fichte, or then later on in Levinas or dialogical thought, the relation between I and thou. And Jens has talked about this at great length as well. And then in brackets, I just provided another possible starting point, that's divine revelation as a starting point. I will not focus on this because my interest is to see how far we get on merely philosophical grounds. But I just want to mention it because I think there's a complementary dimension here as well. So this is the general outline. So I just focus on one possible starting point, and I think these different starting points really complement one another. So these different attempts to define and to defend a specific understanding of human dignity complement one another in a very important way. And if we look at the subject, the experience of subjectivity as a starting point, we end up at what one can call the melancholy of mere thinking, of mere thought. And the following considerations are based on some ideas you can find in Schelling, in the later Schelling, but in Spearman as well, in his thinking about religion or the dialectic of transcendence and reflection in the book on persons. And the idea is relatively simple. Thinking is in itself an act of transcendence. Whenever we think, we strive for, aim for truth, for reality, for something that's real. So thinking is related to being. But the problem is, of course, that if you think that thinking is related to being, that you think something that really is, you can reflect on this and consider it, again, a mere thought. And then you end up in an endless kind of unstable dialectic of thinking and being. So basically, the idea that you aim for something that really is the case can appear to be a mere thought again. So there's an unstable dialectic or relation of transcendence and reflection. So the inner truth of transcendence, the act of transcendence, is being, that we reach being in our thinking. And at the same time, you could argue that the inner truth of your thinking, your relation towards being, is that this is merely an act of thinking again. So this shows the dilemma of mere thinking. And it somehow, if you don't do anything else, you realize that you may end up in some kind of solipsistic version of thinking. Jens mentioned the post-Cartesian shape of our thinking. You could argue that Descartes is, with respect to this question, still a very traditional pre-modern thinker, because he solved, in the end, or he framed his own doubt about his own existence by still presupposing the existence of God. No signal, it says. Mm. Perfect. Okay. So if we focus on subjectivity, and if we have this unstable relation or dialectic of thinking and being, the question is, how can we reach reality then? How can this unstable relation come to a standstill, come to an end? And you could argue that, this is essentially the structure of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and Hegel thought that we can come to an end philosophically. But the problem here seems to be that he overemphasizes the role of the significance, the possibilities of philosophy. And if you look at the criticism that his contemporary Schelling developed of Hegel's philosophy, we may end up with a similarly critical view of Hegel's endeavor to end this dialectic, to solve this problem, the dialectic of transcendence and reflection. And what is linked to this as well is that, of course, one's own existence is in question as well. So how do we guarantee the reality of subjectivity, of personhood, if we are subject to this kind of dialectic? And I think what needs to be done is something similar to what happened in the 19th century in the history of German philosophy. Because what Schelling realized is the specific limitation of a kind of philosophy that he called negative philosophy. So merely transcendental philosophy, philosophy just based on the experience of subjectivity. And he thought, well, this is not wrong. And that's very important as well. It's not that he wanted to totally change the paradigm. He said, well, it's important. A negative philosophy, transcendental philosophy, can lead to important insights about subjectivity and freedom, but it needs to be complemented. We need to have another kind of philosophy that he called positive philosophy. So, but this is not positivism. Positive philosophy, at times he even spoke of a philosophy, a Christian philosophy, or later on then of a philosophy of creation, is a philosophy that does justice to the experience that the very gift of being, that being itself, is what he calls unpreconceivable. So I can't conceive of being prior to its actual givenness. And this is where another perspective comes into play, and another view of thinking. And I would like to outline three possible ways of such a new kind of positive philosophy. So a philosophy that leaves the boundaries of subjectivity and the unstable relation between transcendence and reflection, and that turns towards a possible positive philosophy. Before I do this, I would like to make a last comment on the melancholy of thinking. Because I think if you look at, again, the history of philosophy, this very dialectic explains the dialectic of modern and postmodern philosophy. Because you could say we have in modern philosophy an emphasis on the subject and its capacities, and we have, roughly speaking, in postmodern philosophy, a certain kind of anti-subjectivism, so basically based on the reflection on subjectivity and the limitations of subjectivity. And you could argue that the merely modern mind, the modern, late modern, postmodern mind, can't get out of this dialectic. There's always this sort of relation, this tension between this. So we need a different way of thinking, a positive way of thinking that takes on a different dimension, and that doesn't just focus on subjectivity, but realizes that the subject can be touched in different ways, so that it doesn't primarily experience its own reality, but it experiences the reality of something other. So the view is then not that the subject continues to look for a stable ground that really justifies its own reality, but it experiences the reality of someone else or something other, and thereby it cannot but acknowledge reality as well. And I think, well, as I said, we need a positive philosophy that starts off by the givenness of being. And there seem to be three different experiences in which we experience being and cannot possibly question this experience. We can do so. But if we do question this experience, we undermine a specific experience that we have as human beings. Do I just need to press laptop here? Yeah, I just continue then. And these three experiences are, the first experience, I don't speak of the aesthetic experience, but the experience of art or the event of art, the work of art. It's the experience of the other, so the experience, the ethical experience of the other, and the experience, then thirdly, of being touched by God. And the argument runs as follows: if someone really makes an experience of art, then you could explain this in a sort of merely subjectivist manner, or in a naturalistic manner, by saying, well, this person gets certain impressions and reacts in a specific way to this work of art. But you could also say, and this is maybe a very, very special experience of art, expressed by Rilke in the poem about the Apollo of Belvedere, that the work of art touches the person in such a way that it's not the person anymore that perceives the work of art, but that the person now realizes that he or she is perceived by the work of art, and is called by the work of art, is questioned by the work of art. So there's a need of responsibility, a primacy of responsibility. The subject needs to respond to this call that he or she experiences. I think in the end it's possible to naturalize this experience again, and to say, well, we can just provide a naturalistic account of this. I do think, by the way, that we will never find a way, just merely by arguments, to overcome the sort of naturalistic attitude. In the end, here, what is true is what Fichte said more than 200 years ago about philosophy. What kind of philosophy you have shows what kind of person you are, or the other way around, what kind of person you are determines which kind of philosophy you have. So it's not just a question of arguments, it's a question of self-understanding. It's in the end a moral question as well. So how do I react to this being called, being touched by the work of art? And I think this becomes quite even more persuasive if you look at the experience of being touched by the other. Jens already mentioned Levinas and Levinas's phenomenology, but there are other thinkers as well who sort of who look at the moral experience and demonstrate that the moral experience is not just an experience that can be explained in just terms of inner subjectivity, but that it's an experience of responsibility, not just of freedom, an experience of being called to do justice to the other, being called to the suffering other. And I think this is an important dimension here as well, because from a moral perspective, you may be able, if you think about the dialectic of transcendence and reflection, to deny your own reality as a person. Maybe that's possible. But vis-a-vis the other, there's a moral boundary to denying the reality of the other. Yeah? You can be playful and say, okay, I'm not sure, maybe I'm a solipsist, maybe I do not even exist, maybe it's just my mind or my process of thinking that exists that I can be sure of. All the sort of Cartesian, post-Cartesian doubt that's possible just with respect to if you take on a very individualistic, subjectivistic approach. But as soon as you encounter a suffering other person, it's immoral to deny the reality of the other person. So you could say what comes, and this is something that comes into play with Judaism and Christianity as well. Think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. In a certain way, what the parable tells us is a constitution of subjectivity. The Good Samaritan then receives his identity, knows who he is, not by thinking about himself, but by being called to help the other, being called to commit an act of mercy, to be merciful. And I think this is where the skeptical tendency really comes to an end. And this is where a positive philosophy could say, well, the reality of the other is unpreconceivable, meaning that the reality of the other cannot be conceived of prior to its actual givenness. It's an experience, it's a gift that we experience here. we can deny this gift. We can reduce this gift to just an illusion or a mere phantasma, or to something that the subject has developed. But then we end up in some kind of solipsism, which really turns immoral if we deny the reality of the suffering other person. And then thirdly, I do think that, and this is not meant to be a theological argument, strictly speaking, it's, I think, even a philosophical argument to say there is an experience of being touched by God that we cannot, we can from a naturalistic perspective, but again, for moral reasons, we cannot simply reduce to an experience within our mind. Descartes follows an interesting trajectory here because he does talk about the idea of God that he finds in himself. So you could argue that even Descartes is still, a pre-modern figure here, because he realizes there is a presence of God in his mind that limits his possibilities to put everything into doubt. But of course, you could also say that we do need maybe religion in order to overcome finally this dialectic. And this is where I think religion does play a role, not as a starting point. This would be more in the theological argument, but maybe as a postulate to say, well, God is present in religion, and the understanding of God and of the human being in religion is such that, in Christianity and Judaism, is such that the human being is created by God and loved by God and is meant by God. So there's a meaningful relation, a relation of an interpersonal relation between the human being and God. And I do think this is where basically the concept of creation comes into play, or you could say maybe even from a philosophical perspective, we need some kind of philosophy of creation that acknowledges the gift of creation and that thinks about the gift of creation. We can't do this nowadays in the way Schelling did in the context of the 19th century. Jens mentioned Robert Spearman. I think he does develop this kind of philosophy of creation in his thinking about persons and personhood, because he would argue this is not a theological argument, but it's an argument that understands reality already in a specific manner, in the manner of as being created. And then the person realizes that he or she is not dependent on the processes of subjectivity. This dialectic of reflection and transcendence comes to an end when the person understands itself as created. And then the person understands itself as loved, as wanted, as being given by God. And so I do think what we need in this discussion about the person, we need to overcome a specific philosophical limitation and a specific view of reality that's very much based on modern and postmodern premises by looking at a philosophy of the unpreconceivable, of what can't be understood or conceived of prior to its actual givenness. It's a philosophy that overcomes the a prioristic tendencies of modern thought and looks at what is already given. And this would be the person. And this is where then the phenomenological tradition can be quite important and successful as well, because it sheds light on the performances of a person, of how the person relates to his or her nature, how the person is. And this is where basically the life world experience, even Peter Singer's life world experience, can be reassessed. Because we do not say, oh, there is a big gap between theory and how we relate to other people. No, we take the relation that we have to other people as prior, as something that we need to reflect on, as something given that shows us something about the very nature of our own personhood. And I do think, and this leads me to my concluding remarks, that there may be an indispensable nature of Christianity here, and this may lead to some discussions later on in the afternoon as well. And Jens's paper has already raised this issue as well. We do know that this thick concept of personhood, the concept of person as embodied, and you could say my approach to the question of personhood via nature as a starting point would take on the embodiment of person, or person is relational or social. So this would be the intersubjectivity approach to being a person. Or then person is free, as rational or free. So this subjective starting point. That this concept, this thick concept of a person, is hugely influenced by Christianity and by dogmatic Christian debates about God, about Christ, about the Trinity, and then about the human being as well. And then you could say, well, can't we preserve the ideas that we have in our modern world about the person without Christianity? People such as Jürgen Habermas would argue, yes, we can, not yet, but we hope to be able to translate what is meant by being made in the image of God, for example, in purely philosophical terms. And the interesting thing is that Habermas would say that we haven't achieved this yet, and that he couldn't achieve it, and he hasn't achieved it yet. So this translation process. But he never thought about the possibility that this translation process is not fully possible, that this translation process, to translate the idea of what it means to be made in the image of God or to be created is only possible to a certain extent. And nowadays, I think we maybe Christianity is really indispensable, because we see signs that when the echoes sound, the resonances of Christianity disappear in society, in the sciences, in the humanities, a specific way of thinking may last on for another generation or two, but then disappears as well. And what we see in these sort of transhumanist debates, we talked about this over breakfast briefly, is an interesting phenomenon, because, first of all, for anyone who's familiar with the history of modern philosophy, it sounds extremely simplistic and extremely naive very often, the understanding of intelligence, the understanding of future possibilities. And at the same time, it also seems to be contradicting our own life world experience. If I were, if you look at some of the people who do theoretical work here, like even I mentioned Harari's Homo Deus. So the question is, how do you relate this then to your own self-experience? You always have to say, well, I experience myself in a manner that is not real, that is problematic. And I think we need to flip things upside down, and we have to say, well, we need to take our life world experience again seriously. And this is where then the Judeo-Christian tradition can help us as an expression of this life world experience. But then we need to develop a thicker, richer account of human beings and human personhood. Jens has shown some of these features, or in this, in my account, I think we need to have an account of human personhood that realizes the person cannot by itself fully define itself, cannot by itself overcome this inner dialectic of transcendence and reflection. Yeah, it can always say, well, what I say is, again, an act of reflection. I could say this about my paper as well. But the end comes, the end of this possibility of this unstable dialectic shows up where I encounter a work of art, where I encounter another person, where I encounter or find the idea of God as something that I cannot have produced, but that's there as given for me, but also given as such. If I say the other person is just given for me, for my entertainment or my questions or my pleasure or whatever, I deny essentially the reality of the other person. And I think this is where the approach to personhood needs to be dialogical, needs to be coming from the other. So personhood then is given. Personhood is something that is not something that can be understood in merely individualistic terms, but that needs the relation to the other. So, a last concluding remark about the suffering person, and this may link to some of the ideas we talked about earlier. Particularly Christianity has brought into the world a specific understanding of a suffering person. And I think your question then about how do we understand this, personhood, if these features are not here. We can all see there's something very tempting about, say, Peter Singer's account, because then you have sort of clear signals, and you can sort of say, okay, there we are, and we can define some thing as someone, so some entity as a person. But I think what seems to be important here is the specific focus on the suffering person in Christianity that shows us, or that has influenced our cultures, and has again put an emphasis on the identity, the question of who is a person. I mentioned the parable of the Good Samaritan, but you could also look at the cross, and you could say, here the suffering person is a paradigm of what it means to be a person. And the French, originally Bulgarian philosopher Julia Kristeva has argued what we find here in Christianity is at the same time a sacralization of suffering and a desacralization, because suffering doesn't have the last word. And I think this has deeply influenced our account of personhood as well, to say, well, the suffering person, the person who may not show the signs of personhood, or that we consider sometimes signs of personhood, is still fully a person. And we prove our own personhood not by thinking or theoretically justifying who a person is, but by acting practically towards the other person. So in the end, the answer to who a person is then a practical answer, it's a moral answer. It's the action that shows us who a person is. And this is where Peter Singer's case is very interesting, because his own action show on a much deeper level who a person is, that his mother is still a person, even though she suffers from Alzheimer's, than his theoretical account. And I think this is something we need to take into account when we talk about the anti-humanistic and transhumanistic challenges that we face in our time, and that we need to take into account when we talk about providing new grounds or finding new ways of humanism in our time. Okay, I end here, and thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
I have no quarrel with your account of personhood, particularly the depth and the breadth. But let me try to represent some of my transhumanist-leaning friends who would respond to you. Of saying, okay, I may lack your depth, I may lack your breadth, but what I have is good enough. So that I can have basically relationships that I need, but I don't have to pay the price of suffering. Because I'm just distant enough where I don't suffer the misfortune of others. And in the case of my own suffering, there's drugs, or there's eventually assisted dying. How would you respond to them? I mean, because basically what they're saying is, you're telling me I'm insufficient, and I'm telling you it's good enough.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. I think this is one of the cases. We need to push arguments as far as we can. But at the same time, I think there are different strategies possible. One is to really look at the everyday life world experiences. So there is something that seems to be what some people, C.S. Lewis has called it, the self-evident. There's something that's self-evident, and you can deny it, but then you're denying a fundamental of human beings, of human nature. And of course, you could say this sounds very authoritarian, because then you have a group of people who say, "Oh, I know what the full account of human beings is." I think in the end, it's not a question of simply theoretical insight, but really of reflecting on whether the other person is able to take his or her own self-experience seriously. And you could say, well, there are certain presuppositions, even in an intellectual debate. You accept the other as a person. And you could show there are certain features in an intellectual debate that support this view of the person. Because you presuppose freedom. You presuppose that the other is not just some kind of deterministic machine that you're talking to. And I think this is the way. And then, of course, in the end, what's important is we sometimes have debates that focus, rightly so, on arguments and theoretical evidence and so on. But of course, they are part of certain ways of community life. certain ways of shared practices. And this is where then maybe a decision needs to come into play. I mean, do we understand, I mean, you mentioned assisted suicide, do we understand death as essentially a commodity or a product, as something you go to Switzerland and you buy it, essentially, and you solve a problem? Or do you see the period of dying as a very, very important, maybe even very painful period, but a very important period for reconciliation with other people, a period for coming to terms with your own mortality in a manner that you've never done before? So I think this would be part of the argument, and you could say we still. I mean, I'm convinced that it's the attempt to defend a life world experience, but of course we are losing it sometimes. We're losing the language. We're losing the paradigm from within which this makes sense. But I mean, Jens mentioned Dreyfus, and I think that there's only one word I would change in his citation when he talks about sub-intelligent. I would say subpersonal human beings. This is, but it's a question of. It seems to be a decision. Nowadays, and this is where this gigantomachia, this sort of battle about the human being, is really more than just a theoretical debate, because how we understand the human being has determined, and particularly the Christian understanding of personhood, it has determined our educational system, our legal system, our everything, the way how we relate to one another, our democracy, our political system. So the question is, what is going to happen if this background falls apart, does no longer play a role? And maybe we see sort of signs of, some kind of revolution, some kind of change here. And then we have to say, okay, what is a way of changing this, perhaps, or a way of stopping it from happening? But it's presumably mainly the self-denial, that I can't see how a transhumanist can take himself or herself seriously, but still being a transhumanist. There's some odd contradiction here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful tour de force around personhood. What I hear you saying is one of the first steps towards a contemporary account of personhood in light of some of the issues around technological relation, transhumanism, is a kind of return to Lebenswelt, right? To the kind of life world, to really understand who we are, our embeddedness in being. We don't forget, in some ways, right, who we are. I wonder if there is a particular danger in moving in that direction, or maybe I should pose it this way: what work do we need to do in returning to the life world as the beginning of understanding who we are that doesn't inherently naturalize our life world? Mm-hmm. One of the dangers I particularly see, particularly in the works of Heidegger, etc., is a return to a kind of romantic conception, even in his kind of later works around the life world. And that seems to me to be a kind of insufficient return to the Black Forest. But at the same time, I think it's precisely in moving to the life world that's important. But how is it we move, recognizing that we are technological beings as well, right? So what difference might that make in trying to safeguard or recognizing that technology is essential, and the production of technology is an essential component of who we are and of our life world?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think there are two ways of answering this question. One is, I fully agree, there's no way of some kind of romanticism or of a romantic return to nature, and that would be quite problematic as well. But what we may need to do is, and this would be part of, when I thinking about human dignity that takes nature as a starting point, this can't be the concept of nature that we find in the modern sciences, an a-teleological understanding of nature. So I do think we need to find some kind of teleological concept of nature that talks about that helps us to understand human intentionality as well. And not just because some theoretical thinkers have talked about it, but I think because it's a basic experience. We do not just want to eat; we want to eat well. This sort of internal tension. So then we are not. This is the dilemma of the post-Cartesian dualism. We are not just somewhere in nature; we are part of nature as well. So I mean, this is the first part of the answer. That basically we do need to reassess a more complex concept of nature that understands the modern scientific concept of nature as a reduction there's not a kind of dualism here, but it's more that the modern scientific view of nature is based on the sort of much richer kind of primary experience of nature. And secondly, I do think, in addition to this concept of nature, with respect to technology, I think the problem is, if we follow a kind of Heideggerian analysis of technology, I think he is very good where he says, well, technology is not just an instrument that we developed, it's a paradigm that opens up reality in a specific manner to us. And I think this is happening. It determines the way how we talk. It determines the way how we understand ourselves. And we can't undo it. We can't go to the cabin and we can't simply say, no, I don't like internet and smartphones anymore, and I just go out hiking. But I think what we need to do is maybe to stabilize other concepts of other horizons. And the two most important that come to my mind are religion and art. In art, there's and this is when Heidegger would talk about art and the poetic dwelling. So art opens up a new way, and you could say religion does, and then thirdly, the ethical experience does as well. So the exceptional nature of an ethical experience, and because then you realize, coming back to assisted suicide, I think many things are possible if you just, from a merely individualistic perspective. So you could say, well, it's just my body, and I treat my body just as a commodity or entity, I want to end it. But then the real moral problem, and that's very often overlooked because even in your moral theology, we focus very much on what does the individual, or what can the individual do to himself or herself. But the problem is if I treat the other person. It's the sort of interrelational aspect here. Yeah, can I treat the other person just in merely technological terms? Can I treat death as a problem that I can solve technologically, or don't I need another paradigm to talk about death? And this is where then the ethical art and religion just provide a more important view. And this is where I think it's a problem of education, of our educational system as well. Yeah, we focus in many countries on mathematics, engineering, the natural sciences, IT. We don't realize how important the heritage of literature, of art, of poetry, of religion is, because it's a different horizon that's opened up here. But it's not an argument. It's simply the opening up of possibilities that's needed here.
Okay, thank you very much. In order to foster the intersubjective communal aspect, we now invite you to a short coffee break of 15 minutes. Coffee is down here in the foyer, and if you could be back on time for Professor Baer's paper at 11:30, please, that'd be great. I'll see you at the coffee table. Thank you. Thank you, Holger.
Yeah, thank you.